Ready? Ready. I'm going to do the presentation half in Portuguese and half in English. Okay. So, Vitor, posso?
Posso.
Ok.
E introduzes diretamente o Jorge, não é isso?
Hã?
Introduzes o Jorge?
Não, então, vou introduzir. Então, já não estou a perceber nada. Sei. Eu vou fazer assim, olá, boa tarde, meu nome é João Correia, sou aqui no AS, sou também presidente da Educação, como prazer por estar nesta joint venture com o Inova e com a Ready AI, e portanto passaria a palavra ao Sr. Professor José Barata do Inova. E a partir daí tu é que sabes. Está bem? E tu dizes também que é um prazer e passas ao Russo. The Russo also says it is a pleasure indeed, and Jordan is going to tell you something. Okay, so in Portuguese we say this roda fora.
Mas eu mostro o link, cara.
Sim.
Está no link, não é?
Tem que estar no link, ou então chega-te mais para aqui para poderes-te apanhar pelo microfone, está a referir. Este microfone é o que está a cabeça do chão.
Ok.
Então, muito boa tarde. Penso que estamos em condições de dar início a esta sessão. Queria saudar a todos, dar-vos as boas-vindas, dizer do prazer que temos em ter tanta gente inscrita um pouco por todo o país para participar nesta sessão, mas também ter aqui sessão presentes na sala, dando mais sentido à palavra híbrido, que agora, de alguma forma, caracteriza cada vez mais esta integração das tecnologias, com o remoto e com a presença local. É uma oportunidade fantástica de poder aproveitar não só, digamos, as competências que a Educação tem ao nível da formação de professores. Eu estou aqui não só como professor da Faculdade de Ciência e Tecnologia, mas também como presidente da Associação de Professores da Educação, mas reuni-las com o Inova, o Instituto de Desenvolvimento de Novas Tecnologias, com grande tradição aqui no nosso campus universitário, e com a Ready AI, que é uma empresa subejamente conhecida, penso eu, e que connosco colabora na construção desta sessão de formação, de educação, em termos em torno da inteligência artificial e educação. Eu estou a ver uma colega com a mão no ar, eu peço desculpa, mas vamos fazer a informação primeiro, para dar... E vou-lhe pedir para as questões que tiver, fazer o favor de as colocar no chat, na conversa, no bate-papo. Está bem? A nossa colega Ana Paula Martins, se não se importa de o fazer. So now in English, it is with great pleasure that I welcome you. So we are here, both myself as teacher here at the College of Science and Technology at the North University of Lisbon, but also as president of the Teacher Association at Educação. And it is indeed with great pleasure that we teamed up with Inova, which is a development and research institute for new technologies, with my colleague Professor José Barata, but also with Ready AI, with Professor Ruz and Professor Jordan, which will be with us to give this talk on the use of artificial intelligence in education. And with no further ado, I keep forgetting that the camera is not there, it's there. So with no further ado, I'll give the floor to Professor Zebrata from Inova for a brief introduction.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, welcome to all of you. So my name is José Barata. I'm a member of the Uninova, and the leading here even a research group in the area of artificial intelligence and cyber-physical systems. I'm also a professor at the Electrical and Computing Engineering, but above all, I'm not here to talking about me. Above all, we are here because we really believe in this thing or this question of the artificial intelligence and its importance for the society from the different perspectives. We are not technocentric people. We are above all humans, and this is very, very, very important for us, being humans, that needs to use a tool. So and AI is for us above all a tool. So I'm really, really thankful that we have this number of people interested. I'm very thankful that I could, or I'm happy that I could have participated in this event. And so I have to thank my colleague, friend, sometimes, Ruth, that will introduce himself, and because he's from Ready AI and has been a person very, very, very much involved in these aspects of AI. And I really hope that you enjoy. Okay.
So can everyone hear me from here, or should I move closer to the microphone?
Move a bit closer, please.
You got it. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. First of all, thank you to all you teachers, the ones that are here sitting in this room, and all of you that are participating remotely from various places in the mainland. So, boa tarde, muito obrigado pelo tempo, and I will stop my Portuguese until I learn more. First of all, thank you so much, Professor João, Professor José, for your time, and the entire team, Vitor, and everyone else. But most important, thanks to all of you for being here. And what I hope that we accomplish in our journey today and next Wednesday is we come out with more questions, some activities, something that we can tangibly, physically implement in the schools and with our students. But I really hope this is just the first step of our conversations. I hope we talk more. I hope we learn from you as much as, and I hope we can offer you a little bit of things. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to my colleague, Dr. Jordan Mrozek. Dr. Mrozek, I call him Jordan, is a learning designer, facilitator, and a community specialist. Having earned his doctoral degree in instructional technology with an emphasis on creative application of learning technologies and critical pedagogy. Oh, by the way, folks, if you want to speak, please go ahead, do speak. If you don't want to speak, I ask you kindly to put yourself on mute. Okay, very good. Thank you. So his work emphasizes on thoughtfully reimagining of learning, and Dr. Mrozek spent some good time at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where he deepened his passion for fostering community through relationship designing and really focusing on equitable future. So currently, Dr. Mrozek leads the entire Ready AI global work on education. He just came from the United States. He's on his way to Saudi Arabia in just 4 days. And if you are joining us from Castelo Branco or Fundão, you will see him in a couple of days from now. So, and he's also leading EdSafe AI Alliance, which is working on building safe, secure, equitable AI for the community and trusted AI in education ecosystem through focusing on research, policy, and practice. Dr. Jordan is fun, he's engaging. I've known him to be a fantastic educator, and I hope you also enjoy your time with him. Without further ado, let me pass it on to my colleague, my friend, also my mentor, Dr. Jordan Mrozek.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for having me. I think the only person with worse Portuguese in the room is me, so I will do my best. I'm sorry. But it is a pleasure to be with you all. We'll go through some exploration of artificial intelligence fundamentals, kind of looking at the basic building blocks of how we understand what artificial intelligence is, what it does, and then, of course, get into some of the details around how we might be able to think about using it in classroom spaces, whether for ourselves as educators, administrators, policy leads, but also working alongside of students in their learning journey as well. As Ruz was mentioning, I think something that I think is really important in my own work and something that I've been using as a guide for myself is that we are always in a process of just trying to ask better questions, right? We may not have all the answers, right? But we live in the we live in the world that our questions create, right? And so as we think about this, we may have strong feelings that we love artificial intelligence. We may have strong feelings that we don't like artificial intelligence. I think both of those perspectives are good, right? We need both of those places as we work through this process of this emerging technology, even though it's very much been in development for, over half a century at this point in time. But the way that we have seen it develop over the past year with generative artificial intelligence like ChatGPT, Microsoft Copilot, or various other kind of generative pieces of artificial intelligence, definitely means that we are in a place where we need to sort of better understand the role of how it's going to work inside of our schools, and especially the future that it's going to create alongside of our students, right? So if you have questions, if you're in the room, yell. If you are not, feel free to drop those questions in the chat. Go ahead and type them, and we will try to get to them as best as we can throughout the time that we have together. So as we think about the design and development of artificial intelligence and looking at demystifying it, right? It might seem like a very large thing, incredibly complex, but I like to use this framing of the AI K-12 initiative that very much looks at how we might establish guidelines or pieces of the puzzle for artificial intelligence, and breaking it into these 5 big ideas that all work together as a system to sort of help us better understand what this thing can be. So as we begin to explore these big ideas, we want to acknowledge that one of the ways in which I have used this, and one of the ways in which I try to use this with students, knowing that in some of our work, we've worked with students as young as kindergartners, right, in talking about AI, knowing that they have these things at home, right, in one way, shape, or another. And so they're aware if they don't know the full details of it, but just gentle exposure at young grade levels and trying to build I call from a literacy to a fluency pipeline, right? If we talk about technology and understanding that I am just the littlest bit literate in Portuguese, but I might get to a place at some point in time where I can be much more fluent, right? Being able to creatively reconfigure that language to express myself, to create language, to create poetry, right? We can think of technology working in that same way, right? We can be literate in a technology and be able to use it in very simple ways, or we can be able to develop a fluency of a technology to be incredibly creative with that thing, right? So as I look at these and these big ideas in AI, one of the ways in which I frequently talk about it is that if you think about it, each one of these things is an action or an actionable item that a piece of artificial intelligence can do, whether by itself or with our assistance, right? So there's always a human in this process as we imagine it. So as we look at it, we'll take a look at what each one of these means, but we talk about that artificial intelligence perceives, artificial intelligence decides, artificial intelligence learns, artificial intelligence interacts with us, and artificial intelligence impacts society in different ways, right? So we can see that each one of these ideas is actionable unto itself. It might also, again, be something that we need to, as humans, interact with artificial intelligence to do, right? So we need to keep in mind that we are making sure that there is a human in the loop, right? That becomes really important throughout this process, right? My father was a lifelong educator, taught in schools in the United States for over 30 years. And I know that something that comes up a lot in my conversations with teachers and something that I very much believe in is that AI does not replace teachers, right? AI is an assistive technology when we talk about education, but the real deep work of teaching and learning is built upon relationships inside of a classroom, right? So we are not talking about pieces of AI coming in and taking jobs from teachers. No one is advocating for that, right? I'm not, right? Certainly. So we need to make sure that we are acknowledging that teachers still hold a central place in the classroom. The work of artificial intelligence or thinking about what AI can be inside of a classroom might be about efficiencies, making things go faster, right? Making things easier for teachers, perhaps giving them ideas on lesson plans, right? But it's not checking homework for teachers. That's too risky, right? It's not making sure that it somehow takes the role of a teacher, right? We don't want that. Right? We want to make sure that teachers are still in the loop and are central pieces of a classroom. So as we go through this, I just want to make sure that we set that tone up front and we make sure that that's very clear. So beginning to step forward and demystify some of these and talk about them in very tangible ways, right? So we'll go through each one briefly and then we'll dig a little bit deeper. When we talk about AI perceiving, it is not simply looking at the outside world through some type of sensor or some type of ability, right? But it is gaining information about that outside world, right? So in the image that we have up here on the screen, we can notice that in this very stereotypical picture of like my camera on my phone, right? Automatically, it is putting these yellow boxes, right, around the face, right? If we think about the older examples that might exist, we know that old cameras didn't automatically detect a face, right? So it's perceiving what is inside of that image collection, okay? Again, we'll go deeper each time. When we talk about AI deciding, right? It is providing choices or giving us some type of feedback, right? So some of the most common examples of the AI deciding are these algorithms that might make decisions about what kind of content or what ad you might get on your Instagram feed, right? Or your Facebook feed, or it might be, you know, some type of streaming service like Netflix or something that, hey, you like this show, you might also like this show, right? It's taking in information and trying to make a decision for you, right? So there is some type of weighting of the things that you have done and then trying to make an expectation about what you might do next. We talk about AI and learning, right? In this example, right, we have some of these things, and you'll notice that as we go through this, these ideas feed and overlap on top of one another, right? So they're never just discrete entities. But in this particular example, very similar to the camera one that we were just looking at, right? We may have a car that is self-driving. We know that we might be able to feed that car with enough data that, let's say, as soon as it starts driving on the 1st of the month, it is capable of driving in the streets. But we also know that new cars come out, new trucks come out, new signs come out. So we can't just let it sit with the information that we've given it, right? It needs to have this adaptable learning facility to it so that it can then say, these were all of the cars before. Oh, but now this thing fits into what I understand as a new car, right? It has to be able to gain that information and add that information into its existing databases and algorithms to then make choices, to then learn from, right? So it is gaining this ability to adapt and learn. We talk about AI has an interaction component with it as well, right? It is something that for us, we either speak to it, we might touch it, right? But there is some type of human element that goes into this process for us. So when we think about very frequently, and we have my nieces and nephews, or if you have children, right? If they're talking to a device at home, right? It's using a verbal cue. I'm not going to say her name, but the one on my phone, right? You might say that name and it will then trigger the microphone turning on. So for you to tell it things, right? So there's different kinds of interaction that can occur. But again, this is an essential component of how we understand these artificial intelligence systems. For generative artificial intelligence, if we're thinking about ChatGPT or Copilot or other than that, the interaction is text-based, right? We're typing into it and of getting some type of feedback out of it. And then lastly, we know that technology does not exist in a vacuum, right? Technology impacts people, it impacts systems, right? And so when we talk about the ways in which technology, like a self-driving car, exists, it's not just a self-driving car, right? It is a self-driving car that someone might be using instead of a taxi. I was in a city in Arizona in the United States recently where the car company is called Waymo, but it's an entirely driverless car, but it's on the road with Uber drivers, taxi drivers, right? And so the existence of AI in this case is having an impact on the economy, right? On workplace. So no matter what kind of technology we design that is predicated upon artificial intelligence, it is always going to have some type of social and cultural impact as well, right? And so we need to keep that in mind. So those are the 5 kind of key building blocks that we want to keep in mind as we think about artificial intelligence systems and ways that we might describe them to young children all the way up to adults, right? They're essential components. I think you could also, I have tried, but I also would recommend use this with my parents as well, right? There is a way in which we talk about these things that we can demystify, right? This thing that is, it's not just a black box, right? The phone is not just a thing that is magical. It has all these systems that are working alongside of one another that play a part in how we use it and how it impacts the world around us. So to dig a little bit deeper into each one of those, think about perception, right? So if we talk about perception, it's important that we keep in mind that perception is more than just the information that exists out there in the world. It's how we take in that information. And all of us takes in that information differently, even though we may have similar sets of built-in human sensors, as we might call them, right? So when we think about sensors, that is oftentimes what we use in robotics or computer science to sort of best understand what this thing is, right? But if we think about this from a very basic standpoint, right? Many people have the 5 senses, right? You can hear things, you can taste things, you can feel things, you can smell things. That's the basics that we understand about how we have translated many of the things that we have as people into artificially intelligent systems. Now, there are more than that because we are also more than that, right? So some of the other things that you might think about when you're talking about artificially intelligent systems and things like your phone is that there might be cameras that capture images, right? There might be microphones to capture sound. So we may have similarity to eyes and ears, right? Or the way in which we see and hear. But there's also these other things that exist in your phone. Accelerometers, how fast is it going, right? Sometimes you might get a notification if you're driving on your phone and you're using a navigation app that you're going too fast, right? In that area, right? It is using your accelerometer data to understand that in addition to GPS data, right? To understand where you are. How fast you're going. Okay, no problem, no problem. But we also know from using our phone that there's things like heat sensors, pressure sensors, right? So those are just some of the ways that both we as people understand the world around us, but also how technology understands the world as well, right? So it's more than just the 5 senses, as we are just the more than 5 senses. It's also important to note too that if we think about sensing as a human characteristic, people do that differently as well over time, right? So I used to study music, so I've been in a lot of music halls and a lot of bands and concerts. I guarantee you that my hearing is not as good as it used to be, right? And I might hear something differently than you might hear something differently than they might, right? So the way in which we sense is also very different. So we also try to keep that in mind and understand that that also plays a part, not only in how we might use technology, but very importantly, how we might design technology as well, right? Any technology that we have, including artificial intelligence, is an accumulation of human decisions, right? No technology perfectly in a vacuum, right? It is not perfect out of the gate. Any technology has the values of the society that it comes from. It has the values of the person that creates it, right? So those are important things to keep in mind as well. And that, again, plays a part in how we understand society's or AI's impact on society too, right? So again, these ideas overlap and feedback on one another. So the example from above that came to mind too, and that we have here, right, with the faces, is that when we talk about perception, it has been fed data, right? That technology has been fed data that says these two things, I'm pointing at my eyes, right? With this thing as a nose and this thing with a mouth is a face, right? That's what we have coded into the technology. So it now looks at that picture and is able to say, oh, these two things here are faces near one another. And generally, I try to focus on those. Whereas if you looked at the family photos from my childhood on vacation, and you see that no one in my family was capable of taking a non-blurry photo, right? Like everything is different, right? Like we have technology now that eliminates that because it says, these are the important things. These two things with a nose and a mouth, face, focus on that, right? It is not only looking at the data, it has perceived that data and made a choice about it, right? So we're talking about these systems that are capable of rendering these kinds of choices. When we talk about learning and an AI's capability to learn, we're looking at things that we call representation and reasoning, right? It's creating these sort of images of the world, the ways in which we understand things around us, and we make choices based upon that. A very common thing to look at, which we'll get a chance to very briefly, is how we arrive at a yes or no answer, right? So one example that I very commonly use in this is like, if you wanted to play guess an animal, right? And you had to go step by step in that process, well, you could walk through this sort of onesie-twosie kind of questioning, right? Does it swim? Yes or no? So we have categories that are created now, right? So we're creating representations of things, swimming as a category, right? And it's reasoning based upon that. So if we want to continue down that process, we might be able to then ask questions, or for our purposes, we may tell the AI, right? We may code the AI to then say like, well, this is the next category you should look at, right? Is it going to fly or is it going to have scales, right? And so then it will continue to render decisions based upon all of that, right? We're teaching the machine how to learn and make choices. It's what we call a decision tree, right? So we're talking about decision trees and the sciences thereabout here. But started with this first question, right? And it uses the answers to choose the next question, further narrowing it down over and over and over again until we arrive at this being the answer that you want, right? Now, something that's very common that we talk about with artificial intelligence systems now is that no artificial intelligence system is perfect, right? They do things that are called hallucinating, which is where they sort of make up data, make up an answer based upon the data that they have, right? So we can't always trust artificial intelligence systems. But an example of that would be in the next slide. Well, not everything fits this like binary situation, right? Where we have yeses or nos. So in this situation, does it have scales? It swims. The penguin and the octopus are two very different things, right? So looking at this example on the screen, right? So we have to sort of further decide how we're going to narrow this thing down, right? Because if we would have started with our first question in the decision tree and said, does it have limbs? We may have gotten a similar category. Does it have 4 limbs is very different than does it have 8 limbs, right? So we need to make sure that we're constructing and using the AI with as much data as we can and making sure that our interactions with that data up front are as positive, so far as reinforcing the positive data and the correct answers that we want to get the answers out at the end, right? There'll be another example later on that we can use to sort of qualify this. But this is how we're creating representation and reasoning schemas inside of AI, right? We are feeding it with an amount of data. We are looking for the right outputs from that data, but we have to be involved in that process, right? It doesn't just magically know the answer up front. So when we talk about this idea of learning and machine learning, we're also looking at this process of representation reasoning. How does it learn? So this is a very good graphic to sort of understand the basic components of how this functions. With any piece of artificial intelligence, especially when we're talking about generative AI, right, and these large language models is what they're often called, right, there is an enormous amount of data that is flowing into them, right? So we need to have, again, these triangles, circles, and squares are all being fed into it, right? So for the purposes of something like your ChatGPT, it is taking in an enormous amount of the internet's history and data and feeding it into it. And we'll come back to it, but that might be Wikipedia. That might also be my Facebook posts. I don't think those two things are as good as one another if we're talking about how we rank data and knowledge, right? I think we need to keep that in mind. But we're taking all of this into these systems, right? We are then telling the piece of AI through human reinforcement learning that says the right answer are the triangles, right? In this example here, right? We are saying that now that you have all these things combined, the output that we want this thing to learn from are these triangles. Only then will we get the right answer, right? We need to provide this verification, human reinforced learning along the way to get the right answer back out of the output. Again, we'll come back to that. So when we talk about human AI interaction, this is another piece here, is that as we're digging into what this AI interaction looks like, well, computers can kind of talk a little bit. Mostly they understand it through what we call speech generation. When we think about this interaction though, there's a difference between interacting and talking, right? There is a conversation that occurs that feels very natural that we often do not have with technology. Coming back to the example that we had earlier and looking at these two pictures down here below, right? This one over here on the left, right? Interaction. There's a genuine exchange of ideas, a genuine exchange of conversation. Hello, how are you? What are you doing today, right? Those kinds of questions and answers. As opposed to over here on the right-hand side where someone is just being talked at, right? So when we think about this process, if we were to say the name of the thing that exists in my phone, that's not a very natural process when we're talking about how we interact with one another, right? Because I can just look at you and begin talking and you understand that like, we are now engaged in a process here, right? At this moment in time, I can't just look at my phone and say, what's the weather outside? I have to provide it a cue, right? So there's this entire discipline about like how we understand this thing about human AI interaction, right? One of the most famous examples of this sort of thought experiment is through the Turing test. Alan Turing is a godfather of artificial intelligence, certainly of computer science. Alan Turing had this thought experiment that basically said, can you replicate human intelligence through text? In this example, the girl on the far left is speaking to both the boy and this robot over here, but she cannot see either of them in this example, right? In this example, if she can't tell the difference in the responses that she is getting back between the boy and the robot, that meets Turing's definition of an intelligent machine. The robot is thought to be intelligent if you cannot tell the difference in interaction. Now, there's a little bit of controversy here because this also only limits the kind of interaction to text-based interactions, right? It says nothing about the many ways that we as people interact with one another. being in a room with one another, shaking hands, me seeing you nod, right? The way in which we might have nonverbal communication, right? Or have verbal communication, right? So we are passing up a series of things here that are very important to understanding, and it provides an evolution of how we understand human intelligence over time, right? It's not just the brain typing or writing, right? But human intelligence is also about the emotional intelligence of people being in a room together. So this was initially one small formulation of how we understand intelligent machines. There are other contemporary examples that people have provided to understand what general intelligence might be. You could call it AGI, or artificial general intelligence. There's the example of one of my personal favorites, because I'm slightly addicted to coffee, but is the coffee example, is that we could call a piece of artificial intelligence intelligent if it suddenly woke up in someone's house in the morning and could figure out how to make coffee without any type of prompting. Because that involves a series of complex decisions. You have to find out where the kitchen is. You have to find out where the coffee maker is. Is the coffee ground? Is it not ground? Is it a pod? Is it not a pod? Right? There's like a series of things there that we understand that we would have to navigate, and we have that experience. Another example is what's sometimes called like the freshman year example. But could an AGI, or a piece of artificial intelligence, survive and pass freshman year at university or college, right? It would need to figure out how to do laundry. It would need to figure out how to get food. It would need to figure out how to get to class. It would need to do homework. It would need to make, right, all of those things, right? So there's a bit of an evolution as we're trying to understand what human intelligence is. The Turing test is only one small example of that historically, but it is often fun to think about this game about what might an artificial intelligent machine need to do to be as generally intelligent as a human being, right? But for our purposes, as we understand it, it is indeed kind of a bedrock of understanding how these machines work and how we need to talk about them, because they do have to interact with us in very real and useful ways without being obtrusive. Right? By that, I mean, again, coming back to the example of the thing in my phone, I have to say that name to start the queue to then ask a question, right? That can be, depending on your perspective, useful or not useful, right? You might say, like, I just want to be able to talk to it and have it give me answers immediately. I don't want to have to say this magic phrase to get it to listen, right? Other people might say, I don't want my phone always listening to me. I don't want it hearing what I do in my house, which is why if you have like an Amazon device, there is sometimes a mute button on them, right? So again, these are a series of human decisions about how we interact with technology and what kind of data we are willing to give up versus what we are not willing to give up. So this is like a really interesting one that I tend to ask very frequently when I talk to people, because it gets at that Turing test, but it also gets at something really interesting about like what people value about their relationships with other people. So if you had to test if a computer was really comfortable with humans, what would you try to ask it? I think this is something that I come back to. Sometimes people ask, like, if a machine was comfortable with humans, they might be able to ask that computer to watch their children, right? Sometimes people just say, like, I would trust it if it could make me dinner, right? So what is the thing, and I think this is, again, like a really interesting place, is like, how do we trust technology, right? But also, what is it for a technology to be on level with humans and how we work with one another, right? These are questions of trust, of data, of privacy. And I think they're really important for us to keep in mind, because we are working with students at the end of the day, right? We're working with learners. So these are also questions that we could anticipate them really needing to answer in their very quick futures about the technology that they have. The last one that I think is important to mention here of the 5 big ideas is that every piece of technology has societal impact. So when we think about that, we can give the example of self-driving cars, right, in this context. So we can set up a very easy question for us to work through around, do we need self-driving cars? How do we understand the role of what a technology is in context? Because no technology is utterly pure and good, and no technology is utterly evil, generally speaking, right? So we have this place where we can begin to dig into the area that I'm kind of most interested in a lot of my work, but it's the question of ethics when we think about artificial intelligence, right? So if we think about self-driving cars, do we need them? Well, in this particular example, the young woman on the right, or on the left, excuse me, people can already drive. They're more expensive than regular cars. There are much bigger problems that we need to solve. All valid, right? On the other hand, we may be able to say, like, well, we certainly have people who can't drive because of maybe disabilities, because of limitations. These types of cars would help those people. Maybe if we taught the cars, there would be fewer accidents. I don't know if that's true, but we can understand that might be a pro, right? There might be less traffic, which I think everyone would really love, right? But we can think about these things, and we need to be able to weigh the pros and cons of each side of it, right? We need to be able to have that sort of open space for these kinds of discussions and questions and debates, because these are essential to how we implement technology, and especially how we teach and think about technology inside of a classroom space. So again, when we begin to look at some of these things, the work of, and I know that there's sort of a vast network of individuals who are working inside of this space. And so when we think about this kind of work, the potential benefits and the potential risks are very real, right? As we were just talking about, right? When we look at this, we have to be able to weigh these pros and cons about what this kind of thing looks like. So when we look at this, potential benefits, content development and differentiation. When we think about generative artificial intelligence and the use of something like LLMs inside of teaching and learning spaces, we might be able to say to that LLM, I have a student who has early symptoms of autism, but is not diagnosed. I have this lesson. Can you help me design a lesson for this student, right? That does not mean the lesson is going to be perfect by any means, right? But it's providing us an opportunity based upon a skill set that we might not have as an educator, right? To think about how we create differentiated lessons to meet different students where they are with the abilities that they have, right? So this is an incredible benefit as we think about content development and differentiation. When we think about knowing that, for example, assessment design and timely effective feedback, we might be able to say, you know what, I have someone who is visiting Lisbon for the first time, and I need to give them a quiz with 20 questions on essential history of Lisbon, which would be me. Can you design that quiz for me, right? And it will give you that quiz, and it will also give you the right answers to that quiz. We need to make sure that those are the right answers, right? Because we need to keep a human in the loop whenever we're doing this kind of thing. But it's a starting place to begin to think about what kinds of assessment might be possible, right? We might even want to move away from quizzes, right? So we might want to do something more project-based, right? So we may decide that we want to ask one of the LLMs, I'm an educator, I want to do a project based on Lisbon's history. Can you provide some recommendations? I work with 9th grade students. I work with 7-year-olds. And if you provide that context, you will get some recommendations there, right? So again, this is a place where we might use it as a creative assist to work alongside of us as a co-intelligence, right? It's not replacing us, but it might make some things easier along the way. Again, coming back to that tutoring and personalized learning, we may find that a student consistently struggles with a specific topic. We might be able to go to that piece of AI and say, I have this student, this age, this subject, and I notice that they continually struggle in this area. Maybe it's teaching fractions, right? Or something like that for mathematics.
I would like to ask a question.
Yeah, please.
It's regarding the assessment, even if you are in the loop and you confirm the answers, but then when the students are entering it, if it is like an open question, open answer, then you how can you be sure that the technology is, even if you have the right words, if they are not in the right order,
Sure.
you might have a wrong answer being correctly assessed, or the other way around.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Those kinds of issues are always about being as diligent as possible in the design of the thing, and then making sure that you are not taking anything from the system without reviewing it first, right? So, because I know that they are very powerful and they're very interesting to look at and to work with, but you should never just copy and paste something that you get from one of those models and assume that it is correct, right? And so I know that that's something that there's many cases in the past year that we've seen in various areas where that's happened. We've been in situations where we have seen lawyers construct cases based upon what they get from the output of the LLM, and they're citing case law that does not exist, right? The generative AI is producing this thing and saying it very confidently that this thing exists and this is great. And then obviously there's an example of like, it has hallucinated, right? These cases don't exist. It is bad case law. And so that's, like, again, an example as people are learning the difference. This is not the same as Googling something and looking up a resource online. It is functionally different from a knowledge and research lens than doing that. So even if you say, what year was, or who was the first president of the United States, hypothetically, right? If you ask that question, it doesn't necessarily know that answer. It's looking at all of that data that we were talking about earlier that we trained this thing on. And if enough times in that data, the words George Washington was the first president, that's what it's going to give you. But if somewhere in there, it also says Jordan was the first president of the United States enough times, it might give you that answer, right? So we need to make sure that we're understanding that it is not doing the same thing as Google or us looking up a resource or a piece of research. So it's that your point is very true. Yes. All of these things, to come back to the potential benefits, when we look at this, we're talking about using this as a resource for creativity and collaboration, right? So when we think about this and how we work with it as teachers, we can best think of it as a teacher alongside of us, right? But it's also probably best to think about it as maybe a first-year teacher working with you as a veteran teacher or someone who has been in the classroom for a long time, right? It might have some good ideas. It might give you some interesting thoughts, but you are still the expert, right? As a teacher, as a professor, as a professional. Expertise is still incredibly valuable. So we can't surrender that and assume that just because a piece of generative AI is giving a very convincing answer, that it is right? Just because it gives us 3 paragraphs in 5 seconds doesn't mean that it's correct, or doesn't mean that it knows what it's talking about, right? So as we think about this, we want to make sure that we're building AIs that are intelligent, that are fair, that are equitable, but we also, again, don't want to surrender the fact that we are the people who are most intelligent in the room. We are the ones who have the expertise. And then the last piece of the benefits that I think are important to mention there is that there may be operational or administrative efficiencies, right? This is the time-saving element, right? You might ask it to format a document for you, right? It can do that, right? You might ask it to generate a lesson plan that is aligned to a specific set of computer science standards, right? It can do that. You should always check it, but it can do that kind of formatting and efficiency work that might be able to save you time. And I think that time saving is maybe the most valuable element of making use of AI, because it allows teachers to focus on the relationships in their classroom, right? So When we think about the potential risks, and again, weighing these things out as a very important necessity of looking at these two ideas, we know that a huge amount of time has been spent over the last year and a half talking about academic dishonesty and plagiarism, right? This thing is, perhaps most frequently I hear it referred to, is it's the calculator for the humanities, right? What calculator did at the turn of the mid-20th century to say that you no longer need to do long division if you don't want to, right? Get rid of that process. Now this thing can structure a 3-paragraph essay for you, right? And it can do it somewhat well. So that is a very real concern. I will say one of the things that I get asked most frequently, and one of the things that I am very adamant about, is that there is no such thing as an AI plagiarism detector. They do not work. They fail all the time. So unfortunately, right now, we are in a place where we still have to deal with this thing as it exists, but become a little bit more aware of the signs of how this thing might work, right? Because it will repeat language. There are ways that we can become more visually and through the written word adept at seeing the kind of academic dishonesty whenever we see an AI-generated essay, right? But there is no automatic detector that will save us right now. It doesn't exist. Thinking about that, diminished student and teacher agency and accountability. Now, I think this is more important when we talk about students, right? But everyone is always looking to save time, right? So I want to acknowledge that we need to maintain student agency and teacher agency in the classroom, right? We need to make sure that the decisions about technology are maintained, right? So we're keeping accountability inside of this space. Who is making these decisions? How are they making these decisions? Are all very important. The other thing that I think is really important in that bottom row there is about student privacy and unauthorized data collection. When we talk about the use of LLMs, when we talk about generative AI, I would never, ever input student data into a large language model, ever. No type of personifying information shouldn't ever go into a lab. It's a student's name, address, phone number, passport number, whatever that winds up being, none of that should ever go into a large language model. Sometimes we have seen in the past where that kind of data is being entered in for whatever reason. Maybe it's about grading a paper, which I also wouldn't recommend doing through AI. But we need to be sure that none of this personal data that we have is being surrendered to the large language model. Because for many of these examples, we don't know where that data is going, right? It is going to that big warehouse of data, but we don't know how it's being used. It might be used very much as part of the training for the next data, for the next model. We probably don't want our personal information about banking, our address, included in a large language model, right? So it's about safety and it's about security for the people that we work in service of and also for ourselves. Over-reliance and loss of critical thinking is another important one, again, as this calculator of the humanities, right? Teaching humanities, whether that's history, whether that's literature, whether that's art, oftentimes is about teaching for how we see the world. It's about teaching critical thinking skills and communication skills. We want to maintain that importance in a classroom space. We want to maintain that as an important learning outcome for us. And so as we begin to think about what this thing can look like, we also want to acknowledge that we don't want to become over-reliant on technology, even though it can do some of those things reasonably well for us. Lastly, one of the things that's also really important here is that all of the large language models that we have, all pieces of generative AI, are built in with bias, right? It is not great, right? It's bad. It is also the nature of the beast right now, right? We cannot get rid of that bias. The bias that we have is built upon biased data from the internet, right? And we know that when we're thinking about most of these large language models, especially the ones that I'm talking about, like ChatGPT or otherwise, they're largely taking from white, Western, right, data sets of what is on the internet. And so those types of things are built in to the outputs as well. The best we can do right now is try to ask better questions and advocate for less bias, right? But it is still an essential component of what we are getting out of these machines right now. So we know that it's there. We know that we need to look for it. We know that we need to fight against it, but it is not something that we can just eliminate from the data. It's not something that we can just eliminate from the tool. It doesn't exist right now. So bias is an essential piece of this. And similar to that is that it also lacks a certain form of cultural sensitivity because of that, right? Thinking about where this data is coming from and who designs it, right? It is largely designed in this space, especially when we talk about the United States, by college-educated white men, right? And so the construction of those things, right, it is built with the values of the people and also the society that it comes from, right? That might be good in some ways, but it also might be really bad in some ways. And so we're looking at how does this manifest? And it is certainly a very distinct potential risk when we talk about the use of these things in K through 12 education, and also in higher education too. It's important to note. So as we work through these sort of fundamental components about AI in K-12, I wanted to provide you with these sort of 7 that I think are also important to come out of the work of Code.org and Teach AI. We want to be mindful that we're keeping in mind the purpose of what we do in education, right? Any form of the use of AI in teaching and learning needs to be built around the idea of student achievement, right? It might also be about student achievement because it's helping you save time, right? That's possible. But we need to be mindful that it is about student achievement and learning at the end of the day. Compliance is important. We know that there are various rules and regulations that are built both at the local, national, governmental levels. The European Union just passed the AI Act the other day, and it will go into effect as soon as it's signed. I want to say the date was 20 days thereafter. But of course, we need to be aware of these policies that are in place in various locations and with various enforcement abilities. So we also need to be mindful of how that is shaped, right? In the United States, that might be something like a specific school has a policy. The district that that school is in might have a policy. The state that that school is in might have a policy. The federal government might have a policy, right? And so it's different depending on where you are, but that form of compliance and adherence is very, very significant. We know we want to promote AI literacies when we're talking about this, right? It's not just the use of a tool. In the same way that we wouldn't just plop a calculator in front of a student, right? We want them to understand what multiplication is, right? What is it doing? We want them to understand what geometry is. What is a right angle? Why is that significant, right? We want them to understand these kinds of things. We want them to understand why you start a sentence in a certain way, why you write an essay in a certain way, why you construct an argument in a certain way. It is the same thing with artificial intelligence. We don't need everyone to know how to build a large language model. We do want them to understand how AIs work, right? It is a piece of their future. It's a piece of our society right now. Right? And so if we're doing this right and we're doing this well, we need to be able to teach them those foundational building blocks. Those 5 big ideas, I think, are a great starting point for us about what artificial intelligence is and can do and how it shapes our society. It is really important as we think about number 4 is that we are trying to understand that we are walking that balance beam. We are between this place of knowing that there are incredible benefits to using AI, and there are real risks to using AI, right? We need to be able to teach for that. We need to be able to educate students and also one another about how that works. So we're trying to acknowledge that not everything is perfect, not everything is terrible. We need to be able to hit the sweet spot, that middle point between it right now. That is very difficult, but it is really important that we're doing it because it is only moving faster and faster. So we need to be responsive to the environment that we're in, knowing that 3 years ago, we did not have these things, right? Within the span of a year, we've been able to construct entire new technologies new departments, right? New programs, new projects. I built a program for computer science using these pieces of artificial intelligence. I don't code. I'm really bad at it. But I can get these pieces of artificial intelligence to do basic coding reasonably well, right? And they can help me do that. So it is really important that like they're helping us, but we also need to be mindful of how they're showing up. Advanced academic integrity. This is the tricky one, right? And this is the difficult one. We need to, I think, something that's really important here is that we need to re-emphasize the importance of the learning process as a piece of the puzzle. Sometimes schools, universities, teachers, I know that I've done it at times when I've been a teacher in the past, we teach for a project, right? We want the thing at the end so that we can grade it, right? But learning is actually happening every day. I think we need to do a better job as a system, perhaps, of making sure that we are encouraging students to reflect each day on that learning, right? It's not just about getting to the end and taking the test. It's not just about the final grade at the end of the year or the end of the quarter or semester. It's about the gradual step each day that happens. And I think that is a piece of the academic integrity conversation, is that if we can de-emphasize the essay as the thing that you have to turn in at the end and re-emphasize it towards like, what's the small step that you took? What's the next small step that you took, right? And breaking it apart, I think we might have better success in mitigating against these academic integrity concerns. Number 6 is really important. How do we maintain human decision-making when using AI? We know that we need to keep a human in the loop, right? We are never just making something or taking an answer. We are reading it over. We are reviewing it. We are fact-checking, right? We are doing all of these things that you would normally do to make sure that the thing that we're getting back is what we want and that it is true, right? And then lastly, the evaluation piece is that we want to regularly assess the impacts of AI. This is true when we're talking about schools adopting different systems or different programs, but we need to make sure that the thing that we're doing with AI is actually having a positive impact, and we're doing that over time, right? We need to be mindful that it's not just a, did we do this? Checkbox and we're done. We need to make sure that we're continually revisiting and coming back to these moments where we're revising and seeing, is this effective? Is this important for students? Is this effective for teachers? Is this saving them time? Do they still want to do this, right? That is part of building a culture that values the technology literacy piece and that knowing that they, as humans, still have agency in that process. So I want to keep those in mind. The last thing I want to do very briefly is to provide a sense of context for what prompting can look like. And I know that there's some questions about this, and it's been a growing area. But when we think about prompting, we know that context and inputs matter, right? Prompting is the word that we use to describe whenever you tell a piece of generative AI, ChatGPT, Copilot, what kind of output you want, right? So one of the biggest mistakes that happens, and here's the breakdown. One of the biggest mistakes that happens is that people, again, see this thing in the same way they use Google, right? It is not that thing, right? Again, it is much more effective to think about this as having a conversation with a friend or with like a first-year teacher or whatever your discipline is, right? It might have some good ideas, but it's a conversation. And so when we talk about this, we go through this process. There's a lot of these you can find on the internet now, right? I use this one because it's easier to remember, but we're providing a specific place for us to think about context. We're providing a specific place for us to think about the role that the AI is taking on for us. We're thinking about the audience or who is receiving the piece of generated text or image. We're thinking about the format that we want it in. And we're also thinking about the task and the tone. So what does that mean, breaking that apart? Well, first of all, you want to make sure that with regard to context, you are giving it as many specific details as you possibly can. So perhaps you are a 7th grade teacher teaching in Portugal, and you're worried about teaching Shakespeare. You're teaching Romeo and Juliet. You want that to be the information that you feed the large language model up front, right? You are giving it those kinds of details. You are asking it to take on a role. So in that particular context, again, you're a great math teacher. You're a great English teacher. You have 20 years of experience as a teaching in theater, right? Whatever it winds up being, you are giving it a context for it to say, this is the information that I want to look at, ignore everything else, right? You are then saying, if you're a math teacher, I don't much care whether you have a background in finance or the stock market, right? You are saying, look at this information, don't look at this information. So that's why the role and the context are very important there. When you think about audience, right? You might be designing a lesson. You might be designing a letter to send to parents. You might be designing a letter to send to other teachers. Who is the audience for the output of this thing, right? And that is going to generate the content that you want. When you talk about format, it can do an incredible amount of things. So you might say, we were just talking about it earlier, we were talking about music, but like you might want to put it in photo style, right? You may want to put it in a bullet point list. You may want it as a table for a chart. You may want it as a rhymed couplet as though it was Old English, right? Like you can specify the weird kind of output that you want, and it will do that. It is incredibly talented at shaping the output to a specific kind of format that best fits your needs. And then lastly, the task and the tone are important. It is always going to give you the answer that you want. That is important to think about. But you can give it the task of being critical. You can say, be a critical observer. Is this good? Or you can say, find 3 flaws with what I've just typed in, right? You can tell it to give you feedback, and you can go with a push and pull of how this thing works. The last thing that I think is really important about this process is when we talk about crafting a prompt, is that the prompt you get first should never be the prompt that you go with. It's an exchange, right? It's not Googling an answer and looking at the top 10 results and saying like, these are probably the top 10 best results based upon what Google's going to give me, right? You might say, I want a lesson plan, and it might give you a lesson plan for math. But you might look at it and say like, actually, I need 20 minutes of time to be discussion-based. Can you give me ideas about reformat the lesson plan, but provide for 20 minutes of discussion about this topic? And it will reformat that. And you can say, actually, I need this to better align with this specific group of students. Maybe they're for an audience that I've typically worked with in the United States. Maybe it's English as second language learners, right? It will reformat that to better accommodate that audience, right? And so you're crafting and prompting and getting to a place where the thing that you want is being shaped. But think of it like it is a conversation, or like it's sculpting, right? You're trying to chip away at this thing to get to a place of what you want from it, right? And then of course, in case I haven't said it enough, at the end of the day, you always need to review what you get back, right? So it is important that like, even if you go through this process of using the contextual, audience, format, and tone, read it, review it, sit with it for a day, because you can always come back to the large language model and put it back in and say, we talked about this yesterday. Do you remember? And it will say, yeah, I'll remember. Or it'll say, no, remind me. And you can copy and paste that thing in there. Great. I thought about it, and now I want it to be this, right? And it will adapt this thing back and forth. So again, it is important to know that it's a dialogue, it's a two-way street that exists. Even though it's not a person, even though it is not a person on the other end, you can have this exchange back and forth with it. The last thing that I wanted to show was that the type of program that you use does matter. So we're talking about these different models that exist, whether that's Google's Gemini, whether that's ChatGPT, OpenAI's ChatGPT, whether that's Microsoft Copilot, whether that's any other one that exists, right? They all work a little bit differently. So I did a visual where I did generate me a picture of Lisbon. And I did it on 2 different systems, and these are the 2 different things that I got, right? So it is interesting that there are similarities, right? But of course, I'm not from here. So I'm not as critical as looking at this and saying like, this is wrong, this is right. But the same exact prompt in 2 different programs provided 2 very different things. This is image-based. It's also true of text-based programming too, right? So if you're not getting the kind of interaction that you want in one system, you can absolutely go to a different system, right? And see if it's more to your liking, right? Maybe it's more receptive, or maybe it's giving you a different kind of output. So as we think about these kinds of systems and how we use them, again, it is very much in the style of we need to be mindful that it is a guide or a partner that we are working with more than it's leading us, right? And it's also an amateur. So it's never going to be as smart as us, right? So we need to keep that in mind as well, that like, might be able to help, but also definitely we need to check in on it and make sure that it's doing good work. I think the art piece is really interesting. Of course, we were talking about it earlier before anyone was here, but if you were to, I don't know if it'll let me, but if you were to zoom in on some of the words are nonsensical. They're like, it's not real. Of course, it doesn't do a very good job right now of people. People are often seen with like 5, 6, 7 fingers, that kind of thing. So it's not doing great work yet, right? It has weird limbs sometimes. But you can also ask it again, all the things that I mentioned about crafting a prompt in text-based format also go for images as well. So I could have asked for this in Renaissance style painting, and it would have given me something. I might not have liked it, but it could have given me something, right? And we can have that conversation. The other thing to keep in mind too, that it is less good at with images, is it will not keep the thread going in the same way. I did an example where I was working with some of the teachers who we'll see later in the week at Fundau. And I asked for a Renaissance painting that had a doctor, an owl, and a goldfish. And then I asked the prompt, I gave it a second prompt to remove the goldfish, and it didn't give me the same picture without the goldfish. It gave me an entirely new picture without the goldfish, right? So the threading of the image is not perfect in the same way that the text is, where you can actually have a genuine dialogue about like, it will remember the thing before or a series of things before, right? So just some things to keep in mind and experiment with. But it is very interesting to see this kind of thing happen. And with the images, you may also notice a bit more of like some of the biases as well, right? Something that came up for us too is like, if I ask for a picture of a doctor in the United States, it's probably going to show me a white older gentleman, right? So those types of things are very real, and they are baked into the large language model at the moment. The best we can do is try to push back against it and see things differently and make it work differently. So yeah, I hope that got us through sort of like these very basic building blocks of what artificial intelligence is, right? In a very simple sense. Hopefully it got you some of the big considerations around thinking about AI in teaching and learning and the concerns, but also the benefits there. And then also a little bit of the practical work of thinking about how you might be able to use this in your class, in your building, in your school, with some prompt crafting. So happy to take any questions, but I very much appreciate your time and your patience.
Thank you. Yeah, so we now have about a quarter of an hour, 15 minutes for some questions. I would propose that you can make your questions either here in the room or through the chat. But if you're in the room, I would ask Jordan to make us the the concession of repeating the question, because otherwise it won't be captured by the microphone. Okay, so any questions here on the room or elsewhere throughout the Portugal? By the way, this is Lisbon. If it's something, it's Lisbon. Do not put Portugal. Because people
Understood.
People from Fundamentos won't like it. Okay, so any questions?
There's a lot of questions in the audience.
So I have the first question here on the chat. Are we seeing the chat? No. Let me put the chat here. Where is it? They changed all this. Oh, it's here now. Okay. So, yes, I understood. No, so down to, well, I'll repeat it from here.
Sure.
So one question by Sandrina Souza from the south of Portugal, Olhão. I know Dream by Volvo to generate images. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this program. Is there anyone else to do it? So generating image. I would say dozens, but Jordan, please.
Yeah, no, it's true. There's a lot. The ones that I used most frequently were ChatGPT, which uses DALL-E, D-A-L-L-E, as the image generation tool. Microsoft's Copilot has it built in. Another one that is a little bit more cumbersome, difficult to use, but I would recommend is Midjourney. That's another a bit more advanced one, but also does very good work.
Tricky on the interface.
Yes.
You have to go to Discord.
Yeah.
In order to
correct
the prompt.
Yep.
Coming to prompts, someone Ana Tavares asks, I'd like to know where can I learn more about the correct use of prompts?
Oh.
Actually, I use Poe, which is a kind of catalog, AI catalog, as you probably know. And actually, one of the tools that Poe presents is a prompt generator. So the AI itself produces a prompt generator, which might be interesting. I'm not sure if you're familiar with other sources.
Yeah, there's a couple companies and organizations that are doing a bit more education-focused prompt crafting. AI for education is one of them. I would recommend there's like a prompt library that they make use of as well. So that could be a very interesting outlet to think about if you're interested in prompt crafting. Although I think I will say the best way to do it is to practice. Right now, you kind of have to get a feel for it and also know, like I said at the very end, that you're going to have a dialogue with it. But yeah.
Okay. The other are more management questions regarding the organization of this session. Yes, one of our participants, Ana Rita Amorim, from Condeixa, says that she would very much like that the coming session would be one with concrete examples of AI applications for different areas of the primary and secondary levels. Okay, so yes, that's what's intended.
Yes. On the
second session, which will be from today, next week. So from 8 years from today. And when the participant asks for the certificate, only if you participate on both sessions and be present at both sessions, you'll have a participation ACD. So it's a short session, short training session, as you probably know. And yes, so that's, not sure if anyone can see other questions. There were a couple of questions at the beginning, but they were more statements than questions. Like, I believe that there must be you should be very careful about using your personal data.
Absolutely.
You already addressed those issues, so I think it won't make any sense to coming back to that. Will the recording be available? Yes. this has been broadcasted, broadcasted. We had this session on Zoom, and as you probably know, Zoom has a way of sending a stream to YouTube. So in, I'd say, 2-3 hours, you'll have the stream on YouTube, and that stream, you can always, I'm there. So you can always turn on the automatic translation, which could be perhaps a minor way of trying to, help you understand all that has happened here in English. Okay, so look at the Educação YouTube channel, and you'll find in a couple of hours the streaming portion of this session with the YouTube tools available. Any questions? How often is information refreshed on ChatGPT?
Oh, that's a good question.
February 22, and that was it.
I think that was, yeah, I was going to say it's out of date. Nothing in the past coming up on 3 years now.
Yes.
Yeah. So it has no recollection of recent history unless it goes and scours a specific site that you want to review, which you can do. You can you can copy and paste a website link into ChatGPT, ask it to read that website, and it will learn that information. So.
Okay. I understood that we are going to receive a written report of what has been produced by the AI companion. Will we get it on email? I'm not sure. I'll have to speak with my colleague that does the management part, but if you don't receive it by email, depends on the size and those type of things, you'll receive a message saying how you can get it. Still looking to everyone here at the room, saying if everyone wants to take a step forward. Thank you. Okay, so we have a more complex one. It has been said that AI is, for the present moment, as calculator machines were when they were for the first time introduced. If we take into account that the cognitive capacity of mental calculation if we take into account that most of the students are not able to do mental calculations because they are used to calculator machines, won't you consider, particularly for students of K-12 grades, that AI represents much more than an advantage, a risk for the cognitive loss of faculties that and of critical thinking?
I mean, I think it is a risk, and I think that comes up, especially in a little bit of what we talked about. I don't know that we can ignore the thing because we're worried about it wholesale, right? I think that we still have to find a way to teach it and to teach it well. I think that we do need to worry about changing the system of how we teach and what we prioritize in that process, so that we re-emphasize that the process of learning math is more important than memorizing your times table, right? Or your multiplication table, right? I think that perhaps somewhere along the way, and I speak from an American context, I think somewhere along the way we lost the desire to teach process and started thinking that the scores on the test or the scores at the end of the year were directly equivalent to learning, right? Yeah. And they are not, right? So school is not a video game. It's not about getting all the points and moving to the next level, right? We need to be more mindful of like the smaller steps inside of that process. And so I think that means we need to think about how we teach for that process too, whether that's math, whether that's humanities, whatever it winds up being. Yeah.
And AI has a huge part of it. It can have a huge part of that process.
Yes.
Okay?
Yeah.
As long as we criticize and as long as it's very interesting. I'm not sure if anyone using ChatGPT already did this, But if you want to have a notion of how feeble, how fragile is the way that this dialogue is built up, try to confront ChatGPT with the answer that it just gave. Are you sure? And it oh, sorry, I'm very sorry. And he immediately goes, hallucinating, as you said. So one has to be very, very, very conscious of the limits that we now have, but also of all the potential that AI is bringing us. So it would be a huge mistake, just as we have seen some moves like let's shut down AI while we think what to do with it.
Right.
And of course, it would be questionable. Even if we had the possibility of worldwide having a decision that would mean that everyone would follow it, but there won't. There will always be thieves and people of bad will and some even countries that I would not indicate, but that we've seen lately that are not aligned with the rest of the. Particularly the Western world and the way that we, as humanists, see this type of thing. So it would be a huge mistake just, okay, let us keep this out of schools, I believe. So this is a question.
No.
There's a question here somewhere. So let's keep this out of schools and just rely on the whole, writing, reading, and arithmetic. And that's how I learned with almost 70 years old, and that's how kids should learn. Kids are completely different, as they tend to look to school as a kind of very complex and sophisticated video game, and those are the ones that commit to it, because others just don't pay any attention. And this is the Portuguese context. I'm not sure if the United States ones is similar, but I believe so for what we see.
Yeah.
And so I think this has a huge potential to help us teachers figure out how to better prepare our students.
Yes.
As long as we understand very clearly what are the limits, what are the opportunities, and how we make the best of efforts to turn our classrooms into places for learning.
I think, I completely agree. I mean, I think that the learning process, I think it would be foolish for us to assume, for anyone to assume, that just because the system worked 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, that it can't be improved, right? I think just because I had to go through something is a bad way to look, is not a great way to look at the world, right? I think we should always need to be thinking about how we improve society, how we improve school. I mean, the whole thing for the next generation, right? I mean, we did not land in a perfect place and have been doing this perfect thing ever, right? So I think we need to be mindful that we can improve systems, we can make systems better. It might seem difficult and it might seem like a large task, but it is possible and it's doable. I think to that end, we have a responsibility in many ways to make sure that we're teaching not only the technologies and tools that are relevant today, but also the core dispositions or the core pieces of our humanity. I mean, we haven't done a great job of teaching ethics in schools, right? And I think that probably shows in many ways, right? Or at least critical thinking about ethics, right? We haven't done a great job of including youth culture and youth voice in schools and making sure that there is a connection to the world that they live in. It's not just because I say that you need to know this thing. You actually need to know this because you're living it, right? And I think that there are ways that we need to look at the world, and we can shift these systems to make sure that we're better serving students. And I think AI can be a very large piece of that if we use it well, and if we're critical about it, and if we're being intelligent about it. But no one should be diving into it head first and thinking that it's perfect, right? It's a technology. No technology is perfect, but we do have a responsibility to think about how we can use it well.
Thank you very much. We kind of reached the end of the session. It's now 7:30. I'll just look around and see if Are there any more questions here? No? I do not see any other. Oh, yes, 14 questions. 14 messages. Sorry, just quickly checking. Okay, thank you. Thank you for the sharing. Thank you very much. There is a Portuguese proverb.
It's a good one.
God created us with one mouth to speak and 2 ears to listen. My question is, information is increasingly compromised. Will people start to have limitations in interacting with each other? I think that's perhaps a very nice question for each one of us to think about its own answer.
Absolutely.
I'm sure this has to do with much more than AI, but you've seen here a number of possibilities that AI and a very structured presentation of how AI can become in play in schools, in education. So, and I'll thank you, Jordan, for all this great presentation and work. Also, Ruth for having us this possibility. My colleague already had to leave because he had a classroom. So, but thank you, José Barata, and from here, from Uninova facilities. From this joint venture between Ready AI, Uninova and Educação. This is all. We'll meet again next Wednesday, and so I hope to see you all there. So have a nice afternoon. Bye-bye. Deus a todos, muito obrigado pela vossa presença e participação. Vemos na próxima quarta-feira, 2 a 8 dias, para a segunda parte desta sessão.
Obrigada.
And there are 190 200 thank yous.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
My colleague from the university.
Aqui uma coisa.
Thank you, everyone.
Só dizer aqui uma coisa relativamente à criatividade. Esses